everyone. Welcome back to the IDRiM podcast. And this time, we will talk again about the research that is done in the disaster science and encompassing every part of disasters from the risk mitigations until the recovery. So, to this episode, we have very special guests, my friends that we have been in the same postgraduates recently. And today we will delve into one of the most vital yet overlooked aspect of disaster recovery, which is community participation. But as we know that when disaster strikes, rebuilding infrastructure is only part of the story, but the more complex challenge is rebuilding our life, trust, and inclusion. So our guest today is Nombulelo Kitsepile Ngulube, which is she recently get her PhD exactly last year, around November 2024. And her doctoral research actually examined the Build Back Better framework and the realities of the community participations in post-disaster reconstructions, especially from Japan and Zimbabwe. And here she brings a powerful comparative perspective on why communities must be partners, not recipients, in rebuilding efforts. So let's call her Nono. How are you doing today?
I'm good, and you?
Yeah, really great. So let's start with the foundations. So you mentioned in the beginning of your thesis that uh, the Build Back Better. Can you explain to us what is the Build Back Better framework and why it is considered a cornerstone in the modern disaster recovery study?
Okay. So basically, after the 2004 Indian tsunami and earthquake and tsunami, uh, former President Clinton came up with an initiative that they were supposed to be Build Back Better initiative, which is kind of like building back better from what it was before the disaster scenario. So many researchers, especially in disaster prevention, have come up with a lot of frameworks to try and incorporate different aspects when it comes to building back better. Because when you look at it from the viewpoint of saying build back better, you think of infrastructure only. But after a disaster situation, there are a lot of things which are building back better. You are building back better in terms of better risk communication. You're building back better in terms of better infrastructure, social welfare for the people, and also other initiatives or other ways in order for you to prevent or to reduce vulnerability, especially like for the affected communities. But over the past few years, Build Back Better has been viewed differently by different scholars, depending on what they are looking at, especially when it comes to the better. Better for who? Is it better for the ones affected, or is it better for the ones who are actually doing the reconstruction projects, or is it better for the politicians? So that's where the key question still remains, is that when you're building back better, who are we building back better for? Yeah. So that is what mostly motivated me to look at this type of research.
Okay, so I mean, also in yours, we often hear that community participation, is critical. But what does it mean in terms of practical, like on the ground terms?
So participation is a very controversial term, especially when you look at it from the side of, let's say, government officials, and also like from an affected community member, like on the lower level of the chain. So basically, the issue of community participation comes up from Sherry Einstein, ladder of participation. And it was first adopted like in democratic studies, like political studies, where people participating in politics. So in his ladder of participation, there are 8 rings to it. So at the lower level, it's whereby communities, they are just notified. So that's where you have the principles of like tokenism. So that's not real participation when you call people to come and attend, let's say, a recovery meeting, but you don't give them the actual space and platform for them to voice out. And then when you move on to the middle rings of the ladder, which is maybe around like level 3, 4, and 5, you call community members like for reconstruction planning purposes, and then you give them a voice to actually point out what they want. But the overall adoption or the overall plan which is being implemented doesn't reflect what the communities really want. And then the upper levels of the ladder of participation is where communities actually are given the platform. They say what they want. They actually point out their needs. And then in the final reconstruction plan, which is adopted, you have their voices or you have those needs being attended to. But when it comes to disaster reconstruction, practically on the ground, sometimes it's very difficult to bring everyone to the negotiating table. Like, for example, sometimes the disasters will be so massive and they create like a state of panic. And then some of the people, they have like emotional trauma. So it takes a long time for them to actually recover from that and then go to decision making. But as you all know, governments, sometimes they want to recover very quickly. But sometimes when trying to recover so quickly, you tend not to fully engage the affected communities. So it's different from what is there on paper and what happens on ground. Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, that there is a difference in, let's say, it as the time frame between the affected communities and the government who has the responsibility to recover the affected areas. And it is important to bring both of them as key decision makers. So, what do you find if there is a mismatch between these two? Uh, as perhaps when the place is recover faster, their emotional damage also will recover faster, or it should be wait for them to order some sort of additional measures that needs to be taken first before going to making a decisions about the recovery. What do you think about
Uh,
that?
so practically like in different countries, different things happen also based on culture, which is one of the most important things which sometimes maybe politicians or government officials or even disaster managers ourselves, we tend to forget. Like, for example, there is no time frame when it comes to people recovering from disaster. Because I'll give an example of the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. You're looking at an elderly demographic living in an affected area. Those people lose everything. And then 2 weeks later, you say, let's start rebuilding again. But other people lost their entire life, they lost their entire families. So it will take time. But at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that we don't need to rebuild, especially in a considerate manner or in a considerate certain time frame. So all those things come into play. At the end of the day, participation of everyone tends not to be practical and applicable because in some communities, they would take more than a year for them to recover. And you cannot say people have to remain in evacuation shelter or temporary housing for more than a year, still waiting for them to recover. So some situations, they differ. If a community is kind of like more open to participation, even before disaster strikes, because in many communities, there are community meetings, especially when it comes to service delivery in the community. That way you can see how people participate in everyday, in their day-to-day or everyday life, which will be kind of like, which will show, like, for example, if a disaster strike, will they be able to participate in those kind of things? And then also, when I went for my field work in Tohoku, some people were actually pointing out like we didn't get the chance to participate, like no one called us. So those are the kind of voices which you get from the ground. And then you also hear like other people saying, even if we go for those meetings, it doesn't change anything, because when the government has decided what to do, there is nothing for us which we can change. But in some communities, there were like success stories where you will hear community members saying they really participated in the recovery planning process, and hence they have a sense of ownership over those like post-disaster reconstruction projects, which is kind of like good. But when it comes to how to implement it, it's also based on the culture of the community, how they feel and how they participate in community projects overall, even before a disaster strikes.
Yeah, and talking about the speed, I think it is a fine balance as well. So you just mentioned you're doing it on expect them to be in a shelter for a year, and but we don't want to start in 2 weeks. And I think of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and one of the biggest critiques from the local government there was how long it took to start the rebuilding process. So for them, they said it could take up to 9 to 11 years to fully rebuild, and that was that's a huge amount of time for people to lose their homes. I think it was like nearly half the population still didn't have a home a year later, and that's a critique of taking too long to try and make a decision. And I think that it is this very fine balance we've got to have between respecting those who we've lost and via trauma as well as thinking of the needs of the community who need to move on quite quickly because their lives are just basically put on hold until it ends. You mentioned on the community rebuilding about getting all the, as if we can try and get all the community in, but who are we talking about? Are we just talking about the actual people? Are we talking about businesses? Are we talking about utility companies? Who are we actually talking about when we're talking about community rebuilding and community participation?
Okay. So when it comes to community rebuilding, it's everyone's business. So everyone, right up until the lowest person in the community, their voices are important. Because when we try to say participation of stakeholders, because like, for example, you have higher level where you have government officials, you have disaster managers and all those. And then you have like the corporate companies which work on those affected areas, like the utilities, companies, insurances, and whatever. And then you have the people who are affected, like the citizens who stay in those disaster affected areas, including, especially when it comes to women, children, the elderly. All those people need to be represented fairly. Because, for example, when we only include a certain group of people and not include everyone, people always critique, because we have seen like past reconstruction projects where people fail to actually own up or to take ownership of those projects, because they would say, this is not what we wanted, this is what this certain group of people wanted. So it's very important for us to involve everyone, to have every group represented. And then it also, like maybe in areas like Japan, where maybe uh, culture and religion is not too diverse as compared to other countries. Like in other countries, you have like differences in religion. Also, those people need to be represented equally when it comes to reconstruction planning, because there are many things which need to be taken into consideration. Like, for example, should we build temples? Should we build mosques? So if you forget all those crucial elements which make up a society, then you're not building a project which is meant for the people, but you're building a project which maybe might be directed to the government or someone. Yeah. So it's important to have everyone's voice.
Yeah, that's important things that we should take a note that important. Everyone's voice matters as it affects many all scales of society when the disaster happens. So and, you keep mentioning cultures and cultures as also your experience to investigate the differences between those cultures and recovery in Japan and Zimbabwe. So let's delve into both of them. But first now, in Japan, that you specifically mentioned about the recovery from the Kyoto Japan earthquake. So in that kind of uh, settings or the culture that they developed there, what forms of community involvement that were implemented there, and how did they shape recovery outcome?
So what I would like to point out first is that especially like in the Tohoku region, the government gave out a blueprint, reconstruction blueprint, which was supposed to be followed for the reconstruction. But different prefectures and municipalities were actually given out power to follow or to design their own reconstruction based on the reconstruction blueprint. Hence, you'd find that issues when it came to participation or having initiatives come up, they were different from city to city based on how a certain municipality decided to adopt it. So in some municipalities, there was participation of the affected community members. And then in some communities, it was not there. So, and also, it's important for us to note that the scale differed from town to town, and hence the level of reconstruction projects also differed based on how much a community was affected. So, for example, I took part in the World Bonsai Walk in 2022. So we were walking along the coastline, visiting different communities which were affected by the 2011 disaster. And then you could actually tell, like, whether people's voices were reflected, especially when you look at the reconstruction projects. One good example is in Kamaishi Unosumai. I think in my thesis, I talk extensively about it. So even if when you look at the reconstruction projects which were there, you would actually see that there's a community hand in them, because they relocated. So actually the community members were given the platform to design the city in conjunction with the municipality offices. So that part of actually bringing together the members of the municipality office and the mayor and also the community during that time, it was very crucial to actually develop a sense of like trust and a strong bond within the society. So communities were able to plan their city through the Machizukuri system, and they were able to pen out like, oh, before the school was too close to the coast, we would like the school to move to a higher setting or a higher footing, so that in future, if there is a tsunami, school children will be protected from it. And people could choose the type of relocation, because relocation was also decided as another reconstruction policy. So people came together to decide, like, would they want to move in groups or they want to move as individuals. If they wanted to move in groups, they were actually given the power to choose the location of the relocation community, where the community was going to be relocated to. And also paying into particular focus that those people, the Kamaishi Unosuma is a fishing town. So even the location of their new houses, it's close to the coast, so that they are able to continue with their source of livelihoods. And then community members were also given the power to actually enact the Kamaishi Citizens Charter. So it's a very important charter or document which they came up with to actually show how community members will participate when it comes to disaster preparedness initiatives. So every year now they have like evacuation drills in March. And then they also have like the memorial days, which are decided by the people. And also they had like the Hanamasu tree planting event. So all those initiatives were actually showing that people do want to participate in their overall recovery. Because when you also participate in a project as an individual, you have that sense of like, this thing was done by me. So you have that sense of acceptance over a project, rather than if someone brings a project to you and then you'll be like, oh, there's a Tsunami Memorial Museum here, and then we do not accept it. We don't utilize it. So the most important thing is that when you bring community members together, they can come up with something which they would identify with, of which that is what I saw with the Japanese case study. But they did indicate that though it's a success story, they did indicate that they face like some challenges, especially looking at the demographic makeup of the community, because more than 60% of the community was more than 50 years. And there's a low youth population. So meaning that even though people would want to participate physically, they cannot because of their age, and also the community itself. By that time in 2022, there were about like 110 residents living in that area. So you can actually see that the demographic decline is very, it's playing a negative role, especially when it comes to fruitful participation. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned there's a lot there to unpack. So you mentioned there was possibility of population relocation, so whether some groups have moved away from this affected community. My question was like, do you know how many were affected, relocated, and actually how did this affect, which you kind of hinted at, the demographic shift? Was there a lot of young people who may have been there before but then moved away towards the bigger towns and cities, which, as we know, in Japan is a big issue? Any case.
Like for instance, in this case, I wouldn't know the demographic makeup before the disaster. But when you look at Iwate Prefecture, so it's kind of like different from Miyagi. So Iwate is mostly like older people. So even from the older people who were there, who still had like their families there, like maybe their children and their grandchildren, there were actually really few. And in some cases, like in Otsuchi town, which is the next town after Kamaishi, it's kind of like a ghost town because many people died because of the disaster, right? But only older people came back because they have like a sense of cultural attachment to the place. It's kind of like common, especially amongst older people, to be attached to a certain location as compared to younger people. But when it comes to the overall statistics of how many moved away and never came back, I'm not too quite sure about that. Yeah.
As you face those challenges, so there was that differences between the makeup and demographic and like their well-established system in the Japanese recovery structures. Uh, how's the progress of the recovery, even that kind of challenges and the the system that is established. This is well, what you found that it is actually uh, being better, or sometimes it's like, oh, it could be better if there is some young people here, or sometimes like if there is no movement. Also, what I'm also interested in is like it's the event in 2011 was so big that the magnitude of the event will can also play a role in that, or does like in any given event, like oh, even the smallest one, the participations of the community will remain the same, given the what you found there.
Currently, because I wrote a paper, it's still under review about like ways in which the communities are strengthening their participation. Actually, they are doing a lot. They have overally, the recovery is overly improved over the past few years, and communities are kind of like playing a huge role in trying to encourage diverse people in the community to participate through different initiatives. I'm not talking about Kamaishi on its own, but I'll talk about Tohoku as a whole. The government, in conjunction with the local municipalities and like some NPOs which are working in the affected communities, they're coming up with programs where like they come up with issues like storytelling as a way of actually encouraging people to participate. They have also opened like tsunami memorial museums, which are kind of like dotted all over like the affected prefectures, where local people volunteer in those tsunami memorial museums to actually share their lessons and their experiences to visitors who come in the city. And also there are like tree planting events, like for example, the one which was in Kamaishi, the Mega Hama Hanamasu tree planting, where you have the mayor coming in and working together with the local people. So all those initiatives, they're kind of like enhancing participation of communities, not only when it comes to disaster scenarios, but it also is trying to encourage people to participate in their local town building. As you all know, like Machizukuri, it's when people come up and they decide and design their kind of like potential future city, which they would want. And actually, the local municipalities are helping communities to work together to keep their communities going. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's one other thing that something that Harris has said, and it just triggered me a question. With, as you mentioned, there's very, low levels of young people in these communities now left. Is there a concern that with low or no involvement of young people in these community rebuilding efforts, but historically sometimes young people come back after they've had their career? Is there a concern that potentially they won't come back because they have had no involvement in this rebuilding project, and that these towns could just become ghost towns and be left to be abandoned?
The honest truth is, I don't see young people going back to those places. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but from observation, that's what I saw. Because when you look at rural communities in Japan, one thing they lack is infrastructural development, which is kind of like enticing to young people. Of which in Japan, a lot of young people, they are mostly attracted to bustling cities. But here you're talking about a small town, a small village, which is located in the middle of nowhere, no transportation connection, nothing, no malls, nothing. So it's just the reconstruction projects which were done there. Yes, they didn't participate, but overall, when you look at Japan as a whole, uh, the lack of enticement infrastructure, especially when it comes for young people, will make it kind of like unsustainable development. Because I would like to see a lot of researchers looking at the sustainability of reconstructed towns, because sometimes it's not all about spending a lot of money to rebuild for those people to stay in that very same location. If they do choose to, they have a right to. But also, we have to look at the issue of sustainability. How sustainable are those things? Because when you look at the construction of the seawalls, they are very big, they look very expensive. And then when you look at a community of about 100 people staying there, 60% is old. And then you calculate in 20 years' time, those areas will be kind of like practically ghost towns, as you put it. So yeah, it's quite a challenge.
Yeah, I guess like that's the biggest issue Japan faces right now. And basically, that's also what I experienced in the when I also work in Sakurajima. Not about recovery, but also the participation of the community to build the early warning system for the volcanic ash. Where those are my questions at the time, where the majority of the participations actually come from the older people, and they also have the concerns that most of us actually living in the, what do you call it, care house, care houses, where they take care of the old people like that, and like the concerns are, okay, how do we effect with all these people first, given the uncertain informations, and as well like there is no uh, young people participations that can be accounted for. As the well, as you mentioned, Kamaishi is coast town, so perhaps it's understandable. But at the time, it's in the Kagoshima, it was a big city, and like it's supposed to have a lot of young people, right? But still, no young people in accordance that willing to be participated in this process. Now, you also have contrasted your finding in Japan with in the one that in your home country in Zimbabwe. And is there the demographic, particularly in the age, also a main difference there, or there are some other factors that accounted the differences between what you found in Japan case and the Zimbabwean case?
So in the Zimbabwean case, it was kind of like different from the Japan one, because in Japan, people were actually, they participated in various ways. But in Zimbabwe, it was kind of like different. So Zimbabwe, it's still a, how do I put it? We only have a few type of hazards which affect us, especially like cyclones. And the same communities over and over affected by the same hazards or the same disasters. So in Zimbabwe, the thing is, communities were not given the chance to participate in the reconstruction planning, because the case study which I looked at, the community ever since year 2000. So the first big cyclone which happened in Zimbabwe was in year 2000, Cyclone Eileen. I remember I was in elementary school during that time, and we were seeing like the pictures on TV and everything. But 17 years later, the situation is still the same. People who are living in those areas that are still being affected by the cyclones, because it's a low-lying area. And you would think like 17 years on, with globalization and access to media, world coverage of different disasters around the world, with issues of like people participation in different things around the world, you would expect like a country like Zimbabwe would actually adopt some of those principles, especially when you are saying we are building back better. So the Build Back Better says communities should have a say. But in the Zimbabwean case study, it was more of like speed over participation of the affected communities, because disasters affect mostly, in Zimbabwe, disasters affect mostly the poor communities, which are characterized by low education. So those people, they don't have money, mostly. If it comes to them rebuilding themselves, they wouldn't be able to. And also, even though there's like low education rates, but it doesn't mean that they cannot voice out what they want, because when you come to someone and you offer like, oh, we want to do this, do you really want to move, or do you want, because communities at the end of the day, they know their environment better than government officials who be coming in from other cities. So in Zimbabwe, it was not an issue of demographics, like the population or whether the youth wanted to. People did want to participate, but they were not given the platform to.
I think the next question, very simply, is why weren't they given the platform to?
So as I already like highlighted in my previous response, these areas, they are like the people in those areas, they're not like highly educated. So government officials, they would say those people, they don't know how to participate with government officials, because obviously when you are in a recovery planning meeting, there is a certain way you have to carry yourself, and there is a certain way of how you can respond to something. And when the community affected doesn't maybe put it into like cognizance with the education levels, which maybe the government officials would want, they would tend to turn a blind eye, and they treat the affected communities as victims instead of potential stakeholders in the whole planning process.
I'm going to ask a very quick question here, and I think that Harris, you can respond to this one. Isn't that kind of an issue that maybe not as much, in this case study, but isn't that kind of an issue in every community? So I just think of, even in the UK, I can think of situations where that might happen as well, where it's going to be government who'll make the decisions based on what they think the people want, rather than what the people actually want themselves. I don't know if that's an issue that affects most communities, actually.
Yeah, it does. Because sometimes the government, as Tsholotsho Sensei always puts out, like speed. They want to make everything in a fast manner. Like, okay, we were affected by this. Let's get it over and done with. But at the end of the day, it becomes costly when you don't listen to what people want. Because when we look at different around the world, especially in Asia, where there were many reconstruction projects which were enacted, but those reconstruction projects never highlighted what people wanted. And people reacted by abandoning some relocation initiatives. And people sometimes they would rather brave the risk of staying in a dangerous location than staying in a safe location, but which doesn't address their needs. Because when you look at it, there are many factors which would make people behave sometimes the way, or they react the way they tend to react. Especially like in developing countries, mostly issues like culture and livelihoods, they play an important role. But in other countries, like, for example, maybe let's say in the UK, people can move from one place to the other. It might not be that much of a problem because they can actually easily commute to their place of work where their livelihood is. But in developing countries, mostly those people survive by subsistence livelihoods. Where someone is a fisherman, they need to be near the coast, but you're saying don't stay near the coast because it's dangerous. You have someone's staying near the mountains, or staying near the volcano because the soils there, they are very fatal. So there are many reasons which make people settle in dangerous locations, and that's very important, especially for government officials to understand the real needs of the communities. And even if they need to relocate them, I doubt that people, if you capacitate them, if you educate them about the need for them to adopt a certain reason, they will listen to you, especially when you give them the reasons why you are saying what you're saying. But sometimes when you just give them as an order, people are people, they would react in different ways. Yeah.
Well, in addition to that, as well in different countries, and particularly my country, Indonesia, that kind of thing is sometimes in the issue of communication between the government, that in their perspective, mostly, I guess it's also applicable with many different countries where somehow their intention is convoluted by their own ego, as they are, have another political motivations that marks that, okay, this is my achievement, then okay, I should maintain my position as popular powers, that okay, I that perhaps it doesn't align with the needs of the community that affected the disaster. Not only that, there's sometimes this kind of mismatch between the needs and the community and the government usually occurs in the forced relocation that we have. Okay, like, okay, this is like the the flood plains where the flood will happen here. You should move, and then no, like as no mentioned that before, it's I cannot work if you move from here, because like I need to live day by day. And the second thing is like sometimes although, like, let's say the government officials have very good intentions and they communicate well with the people there, sometimes it also didn't really affect their willingness to follow the government because they don't have any options, as you mentioned before. There is no supporting infrastructures that that can bring them to the conditions before the event, the disaster. That's the problem that the developing countries uh, face, and sometimes giving them options to do that are also very costly. And the government is like thinking in the cost benefit analysis that okay, should I reconstruct this or giving them options, and like sometimes it's like the trade off. I need to choose one instead of giving them everything. Now
But
return back, yeah, yeah,
yeah, but like in communities they have their own kind of systems.
yeah,
Like for example, I don't know about developed communities, but in developing communities, mostly they have their own systems, or like people who represent them, people who become the spokespeople of the whole community. Those people are supposed to be utilized because they can become the middleman between the government and the communities. And also, there are many grassroots organizations, like community-based organizations within the community. Governments can utilize those avenues because at the end of the day, as disaster researchers, for me, the first time when I was looking at this topic, I was like, if you're building, who are you building for? Are you building for yourself, or you're building for the next person to utilize? If I'm building for myself, I can do it for myself, whatever I want. But when you're building for other people, you also have to find out what those other people would need. Because even though, as you put it out, like sometimes it'll be difficult for the government to give people options, you rather give them the options of say, okay, the government is willing to build you a house in the same location or in a new location. What kind of house do you want? Let them choose what kind of infrastructure like they would want. Do you want a mud house? Do you want a brick house? What kind of a house do you want? Actually learn about the people's culture, because you can build a brick house. Maybe it's not part of their culture to stay in brick houses. You will build a brick house because you want to be popular. But you need to find out basically what people want, because if you do a project which people don't want, you have abandoned houses or abandoned infrastructure. There's a lot of literature, a lot of researchers have looked at that aspect. That's why even the issue of build back better, it's still under contention. Who are you building better for? Is it for the practitioners? Is it for the stakeholders? Is it like for the affected communities? Of which that's one thing which maybe us as researchers, we can become like a bridge between the government and the communities to actually show the government like some evidence through research, because government officials, they don't go to Google Scholar and research, like pull out all those papers of past reconstruction projects. No, they can say, oh, in the last disaster we spent 20 trillion. Maybe this time, because the economy is not performing well, we might spend 10. But that 10 trillion, is it actually addressing the people's needs? Yes or no? And then disaster researchers are supposed to come in there, like, no, actually bring the community members closer. The reconstruction may take a long time, or the reconstruction plan, the decision making might take a long time, but at least it reflects what the affected communities want, not what the government officials want, because at the end of the day, you would want ownership over those projects. Yeah.
well, that's good words. But we've been talking about developing countries, and we want to know about the developed countries. How is it in UK, Mark? Well, in case of this, I guess like you also experienced some disaster that needs a recovery for the people there.
Yeah, so in the UK, the biggest debate we're having right now is a cost benefit from climate change. And so a lot of so we get obviously flooding and we don't listen. So if we think of, coastal areas, the biggest question is now becoming, do we do a coastal retreat away from these communities? Because some of these communities are costing too much to keep rebuilding. Um, Obviously, some we can't retreat from. So one of the areas that we won't retreat from is London. London is highly vulnerable, and we in the 1970s and 80s built a barrier to protect London, which is already near its used by date, and it needs to be rebuilt again. But in places like Norfolk, so Norfolk is a very low-lying flat area, and it's only a meter above sea level in a lot of places, and it's a bit of a contentious issue because they are planning to retreat back because it's just too expensive to keep building seawalls because it's a huge area. Problem is that the communities weren't really consulted, and when they were, they felt like their voices weren't being heard because they don't want to leave these communities. And it is this build back better versus, is it feasibility is a big issue. And what the government is like, it's just cheaper to relocate all these people, but the people don't want to leave, and it's a highly inflamed situation right now. And in the UK, I think that this is going to be a bigger issue because a lot of our communities are coastal communities. We're quite small. We're not that big. We're like Japan. We're very coastal in population, and so that's becoming an increasing issue. And the other issue is the distribution of our population. A lot of our elderly people live on the coastal areas as well now. They love to move to the coast side, the seaside at the end of their lives to retire to, and that means that they're going to be affected more. And is it again in some of these communities, do we have to move them out even though they've just moved in because it's becoming too expensive? And I think in the UK situation, it's taken a lot of time to work out what do we do, because no country wants to give up part of its territory, but can the UK really justify spending over £1 billion, protecting 1,000 people when the UK is already struggling? I mean, in terms of the Thames barrier, to protect London, the estimation is that will cost over 10 billion, anywhere between 10 and 30 billion pounds to build. But what does that take? So that's about, just quickly doing the conversion, that's around 35 billion US dollars to rebuild, to protect London. But is it worth it? Yes, because it protects over 10 million people. So it's, that is a worthwhile situation, and the government is having to count cost, do that. But that is where I talk about, in the UK, people, where some of the communities don't feel listened to because of this situation. The other one is when communities argue against experts. So in 2000, I'm going to say 17 or 18 here, there was a huge issue of flooding in the UK, and what happened was is that the communities pointed the blame at the experts and said, you didn't dredge the rivers, so you haven't been dredging rivers. When the experts said, well, that wouldn't have made a difference. But they were so like, it's that. When, as the experts tried to say, well, look, if we dredge the rivers, that is going to cause more water coming down at a quicker speed. Doing this, it slowed it down, and they just didn't get it. And then what they had to do was they had to do it, listen to the community, even though they know it's not going to actually help the community, it's just wasting money. So I feel that there is this also very fine line where you have to listen to the community's needs and wants, but also say at times you have to say, no, this is not the right way to do it because of, and this is why. And it's tough as researchers, because we want to listen to the community all the time, but sometimes we have to, draw a line and say no, because this will make your lives worse, not better.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah. So that's why, like, when you look at different geographical locations, so the issue of participation, it's very different. Yeah. So what can be applicable in one situation cannot be applicable in the next. So maybe that will make things like capacity building to actually capacitate the communities, because sometimes I think communities, they don't have the knowledge. They get some of the information from media, and sometimes media can be flawed, especially, and it can be biased. And people tend to listen to what a news channel or a news reporter might say, but not actually listen to the real logic and reason behind it. So I think capacity building is also important for communities to be actually educated, especially when it comes to issues of climate change and disaster risk. Because even when we say communities have to participate, they don't know how to participate. They think like if participation only comes to saying yes or no, or we want to stay here because we are close to our ancestral land, or we are close to our ancestors' homes. But actually, they have to be capacitated to actually let them know, like, yes, it's your ancestral land, but it's no longer safe for people to stay here because of A, B, C, and D, of which I think we have to go broader to actually educating them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, based on your explanation just now, like perhaps one thing that I disagree is basically the community actually also has some knowledge, information.
Yes.
Instead of saying that they don't have any knowledge or they don't have any necessary knowledge, it's I think what is better representation is like they have fragmented knowledge. Yes, their knowledge is limited to one specific aspect, while in terms of the recovery and the disaster, we took, should take a holistic perspective where it encompasses everything and everyone. But since, yeah, as you mentioned, the source of the information is come from different sources, it become fragmented based on what they're willing to hear, or what they are believe on the information that they need. Now, you also mentioned that for the futures of the climate change, Mark also mentioned that this is the preparation of the climate crisis and the climate change, and you mentioned that there's different cultural and the different capacity that needs to be done in order to facilitate the community participations in disaster recovery. So, how can your findings applicable in many different cases, in especially the ongoing and the future disasters? In this case, perhaps we can focus on climate change, or in the future disaster may happen next, given the findings from your thesis.
Yeah, in my thesis, I looked at processes and outcomes, like the processes and outcomes-based criteria. So normally that criteria has been used like in environmental studies, but I try to apply it to disaster situations, like what processes and outcomes will be would actually show that people participated, or would actually show that there was participation or no participation. So I wanted to hear like from the citizens' voice. So they highlighted numerous processes which they believed that they would show their participation. So it doesn't mean them coming to sit down in meetings, but there are different things such as capacity building, if they are capacitated, there is timely implementation of projects, and also fulfillment of objectives. So that process and outcomes-based criteria enabled us to formulate like a framework which was in the conclusion of the, so it's kind of like a basic framework which can be applied to different countries. Like, for example, you have to capacitate people, you have to integrate their culture, you have to integrate their knowledge to it. There has to be overall collaboration between the government and the local communities, and also reconstruction projects are not just how do you put it? What's the simplest way I can put it? They are not just projects for us to just move on, but they are supposed to be projects which are kind of like reflective from where we come from. That's precisely the easiest way of saying build back better. They should be better than what was there before. And also those projects should be kind of like cognizant with what people need and what will make them safe in terms of future disasters. But the most important things is that there has to be a fine line, there has to be an overall footing on where the government comes together with the local communities. Because at the end of the day, the communities need to be also appreciated as potential or as the most important stakeholder when it comes to reconstruction projects. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna leave it there because of time. We've been talking for 1 hour already. So thank you for sharing your finds, your research, especially PhD. I know from experience a PhD is not an easy thing to do. People think it's just, oh, it's easy, you write a few, you write 100 pages or 200 pages, that's it. It's all encompassing for 3, 4, 5 years. It just takes over your life. So congratulations on getting
Thank
your
you so
doctorate.
much.
Anything you want to say, Harris?
Uh, yeah, thank you very much again, no, to come into short notice. Also, congratulations of the next endeavor, and hopefully we can see you in IDRiM conference.
Actually, I miss IDRiM because when you win that award like 2 times in a row, you feel like I can do it. So actually, people are still warming my seat for the first prize. I'm
Yeah,
coming back.
Please do.
yeah, but yeah, I think you can still have the opportunity to join us anyway. So that's it, everyone. We hope you enjoy our today's podcast. So see you next time.